Dear students, I am Dr. Ashok Kumar Kundu from Government PG College, Sector 1 Panchkula. Today's lecture is arranged under the aegis of Director General Higher Education Haryana for the undergraduate students. Today's topic is the famous poet John Donne and his poem Death Be Not Proud. John Donne, as you know, is the most famous metaphysical poet. He was born in 1572 to a London merchant. Donne's parents were both Catholic at a time when England was deeply divided over matters of religion. Queen Elizabeth persecuted the Catholics and upheld the Church of England, established by her father Henry VIII. The subsequent ruler, James I, tolerated Catholicism but advised Donne that he would achieve advancement only in the Church of England. Having renounced his Catholic faith, Donne was ordained in the Church of England in 1615. Donne's father died when he was very young, as did several of his brothers and sisters, and his mother remarried twice during his lifetime. Donne was educated at Harts Hall, Oxford, and Lincoln's Inn. He became quite learned. He spoke different languages and wrote poems in both English and Latin. Donne's adult life was varied and he often got involved in dangerous excursions. He sailed with the Royal Fleet and served as both a member of Parliament and a diplomat. In 1601, he secretly married a woman named Anne More, and he was imprisoned by her father, Sir George More. After the Court of Audiences upheld his marriage, several months later he was released and sent to live with his wife's cousin in Surrey. His fortunes became quite negative at that moment. For the next several years, Donne moved his family throughout England. He travelled extensively in France and Italy and attempted unsuccessfully to gain positions that might improve his financial situation. In 1615, Donne was ordained as a priest in the Anglican Church. In 1621, he became the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, a post that he retained for the rest of his lifetime. A very successful priest, Donne preached several times before royalty. His sermons were famous for their power and directness. For the last decade of his life, before his death in 1630, Donne concentrated more on writing sermons than on writing poems, and today he is admired for the former as well as the later. Dear students, now this has clearly depicted that John Donne was not only a poet but he acted a priest also. He preached so many good things about human life. He preached people that if you do something wrong, then you have to die, and death is a very important agent for all those people who do something wrong, because they fear death. But for those people, those scientists, those promising sportsmen, those persons who work for the country or work for their state in an upright manner, they don't fear death. Now, for the last decade of his life, before his death in 1630, Donne concentrated more on writing sermons than on writing poems. And today he is famous for all those forms which he wrote. Donne was the leading exponent of a style of poetry called metaphysical poetry. Now, dear students, I will in this lecture discuss what is metaphysical poetry now, which flourished in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Metaphysical poetry features elaborate conceits and surprising use of symbols wrapped up in original, challenging language structures with learned themes that drew heavily on eccentric chains of reasoning. Now, these are the qualities which are part of metaphysical poetry, which Donne has also practiced. Donne's words, like that of George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, and many of their contemporaries, exemplifies these traits. But Donne is also a highly individual poet, and his constant use of his great theme, the conflict between spiritual piety and physical carnality as embodied in religion and love, remains unparalleled throughout his poetry. Now, it depicts that Donne uses different themes in his poetry. He uses spiritual piety and physical carnality. He shows that why spiritual leaning is also important with physical desires, and all these remain an integral part of his poetry. Now, he wrote love poems which are still unparalleled throughout the ages. Now, let us discuss Death Be Not Proud. Death Be Not Proud is one of the 19 holy sonnets written by the great metaphysical poet John Donne. As a typical product of Renaissance, Donne wrote a kind of love and religious poetry that shocks its readers into attention with its wit, conceits, far-fetched imagery, erudition, complexity, colloquial and dramatic styles. Donne's poetry exemplifies the rare synthesis of reason and passion, a unique quality which is termed as the unified sensibility. This poem forcefully shows the popular conception of death as a powerful tyrant. Now, people say that death is powerful on this earth. It is unparalleled in its power. Now, the poet basically shows that death is nothing but a simple incident in the life of human beings. Now, the poet presents an unconventional view of death. By addressing the poem to death, Donne says that death should not feel proud of itself or its powers. Now, why death should not feel proud of its powers? Because death is a normal incident in our lives. We have to die at some point in life. If we die, then we get relief. We get permanent rest, and it gives us freedom to our souls. Our souls reaches heaven as soon as we die. Now, it is nothing but similar to sleep. Death is neither frightening nor powerful, although some people have called it so. It has no power over the soul, which is immortal. Now, the poet says that soul is immortal. Why soul is immortal, dear students? Soul is immortal because death cannot kill our souls. It can only kill our bodies. We have to die and our soul is relieved. Our souls are immortal because of this. The poet explains this idea through the examples of rest and sleep. He says that rest and sleep are only the pictures of death. We derive pleasure from rest and sleep, so death itself should provide much more pleasure, which is the real thing in the longer sense. Now, death and sleep are similar as per the poet. Why death and sleep are similar? Because sleep is a short form of rest and death is the longer form of rest. Now, there is no difference between both of them. Now, we don't fear sleep. That is why the poet says that we should not fear death also, because it is a longer kind of sleep or a longer form of sleep. Secondly, our best men get death very soon. Their bones get rest and their souls get freedom. Now, the poet says that those promising people, all those promising people who are dear to the king or who are dear to the state, they die early because God also wants them in heaven, because they have superhuman qualities and God even likes them to be there at His kingdom. Now their bones get rest and their souls get freedom very soon as they die. Now death is therefore not a frightening thing. Now the poet blasts the popular belief that death is all powerful. He says that death is in fact a captive, a slave to the powers of fate, chance, cruel kings and bad men. Now the poet says it lives in the company of fate, chance, cruel kings and bad men. Now, it lives with poison, war, sickness. The poet says that death cannot have independent existence. It lives with poison. Once a person takes some kind of poison, he is destined to die. Once he dies, death has to take his soul away because it cannot remain separate from poison. And during war, when warriors fight, some warriors die because of that fight, and death has to come to the battlefield to take away their souls. So death cannot remain away from war as well. Now let us take the example of sickness. If somebody is sick, he takes medicines, and when he is not going to get well, death has to take his soul away because he is destined to die very soon. Now opium and other narcotics are as effective as death in inducing us to sleep. Now the poet believes that narcotics like opium can give us sleep in a proper manner. Similarly, death gives us permanent sleep. So what is the difference between longer sleep and shorter sleep? The difference actually is our own perception. Otherwise, death is not a fearful thing as per the poet. They actually make us sleep even better because we sleep for a shorter period of time, then we can work, but after death we cannot work. We become totally free. We are independent once we die. Now death cannot operate at its own level. So death should not feel proud of its powers. Now in the end, the poet once again says that death is a kind of sleep, after which the soul will wake up to live forever and become immortal. Now the poet says that death gives us permanent relief from the problems of the world. Now our soul becomes immortal because death has no effect on our souls once we die. Then death has no power over us. In other words, the soul conquers death. It is the death which itself dies once we leave this place, that is earth. Thus Donne degrades death and declares happily the importance of death. In this way, death is no powerful and dreadful for all of us. So we should not fear death as it has no power over our souls. Death can kill only physical traits, but it cannot kill our soul. So we are free from the clutches of death once we die and leave this world. Now dear students, there are certain things which come in the examination and we have to prepare for all those things. Now what are those? Reference to the context. You have to give reference to the context as per the examiner. Now let us discuss first stanza and let me read the lines from it. Death, be not proud, those some have called thee, mighty and dreadful, though thou art not so. For those thou thinkst thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, yet canst thou kill me. These are very important lines from stanza 1 of the poem. Let me give you the reference first. We will write in the examination like this. These lines quoted above have been taken from the poem Death, Be Not Proud, written by John Donne. In these lines, the poet says that death is neither terrible nor powerful. It has no effect on the soul of a person. So, death should not feel proud of its power. These are the opening lines of the sonnet. Now, dear students, after writing reference, you have to explain these lines. Let me do it for you. The opening of the poem, a highly rhetorical and declamatory in style. Here the poet personifies death. He says that death should not feel proud of its powers, although some people have called it powerful and fearful. Yet in actual it is not so. Those people whom death thinks to have killed do not actually die. Now what does the poet mean from these lines? He says that death kills only physical traits and it cannot kill our supreme qualities or spiritual qualities as well as our souls. The souls become immortal once we die. Death does not have the power to kill the poet either. In other words, death has no effect and power over the souls. Donne considers death as a poor thing. Why it is a poor thing, not a mighty one? Because death has control over only physical traits of persons, or it can kill our physical appearances, but it cannot do harm to our souls. That is why he calls it a poor thing. By calling death poor, the poet pities death for its powerlessness and weakness. Now, dear students, let us take stanza 2 for explanation and reference. Let me read the lines first. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men thee do go. Rest for their bones and souls delivery. Now, dear students, we have to explain these lines. First, let us give reference for these lines. These lines quoted above have been taken from the poem Death Be Not Proud, written by John Donne. In this poem, the poet says that death is neither powerful nor fearful. It has no power over the soul, so it should not be proud of itself. The poet equates death to sleep because they are similar in qualities. Let us give an explanation of these lines. In this stanza, the poet says that death is not frightening. The poet attempts to provide us with reasoning for his argument. He gives different examples. If we derive pleasure from rest and sleep, which are only copies and pale imitations of death, we must derive even greater pleasure from death itself. Now the poet says that rest and sleep gives us shorter kind of rest and enjoyment. So why not we enjoy the longer sleep like activity, which is death? Now, moreover, the poet says that those people die young whom God loves most. He says that all those promising people who die young are desired by God in heaven. The poet says that those promising people who are dear to God, they go to heaven as soon as they die because God wants them in heaven. So we should not fear death because it is just like any other activity, a kind of activity which is part of human life. Dear students, death can kill only the bodies of persons and not the souls. After death, the bones get rest and souls become free and immortal. Death actually gives rest to our bodies and release to our soul. Then we should not fear the pangs of death. People fear death because they do some kind of wrong acts. They are involved in such activities which brings death closer to them as soon as they do something wrong. That's why they fear death. But good people don't need to fear death. It actually gives birth to the soul which earlier was encased in our body. So death is not a fearful thing for us. Now let us take stanza 3. Let me read the lines first. Thou art not slave to fate, chance, kings and desperate men, and dost with poison, war and sickness dwell, and poppy and charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more, death thou shalt die. Now these are very important lines, and these are rather the closing lines of the poem. Let us give reference for these lines. These lines quoted above have been taken from John Donne's poem Death Be Not Proud. In these lines, the poet says that man should not fear death as it has no power over the soul. Sleep and rest, which are only just images and pictures of death, gives us even more pleasure than death itself because they are temporary and they give us temporary relief from our daily fatigues and problems. Now we get rest and kind of release which is part of death also. Now, why should we fear death then? Because death gives us even lot of pleasure, even more pleasure than sleep and rest. Now, then the poet says that we should not fear death. Let's discuss the explanation for these lines. These lines, the poet blasts the popular belief that death is all powerful. Death, in fact, is a captive or slave to the power of fate, chance, cruel kings, and bad men. Now, opium and other narcotics are as effective as death in inducing us to sleep. They actually make us sleep even better. Now, this is poet's version that death is just like sleep and other rest-giving activity, so we should not fear death. Death cannot operate at its own level. Now, the poet says death has no independent existence, it has to be with some activity. Now, it is nothing and no separate existence is there for death. Now, it seeks the help of poison, war, and sickness to show its effect, in which company death lives. Death is only a short kind of sleep, after which the soul will wake up to live forever. Now, it is just like sleep, and once we wake up from death, we are permanently in heaven. We have no existence on earth after that, and our souls are free to live forever, and death cannot kill us anymore. Moreover, the soul conquers death. It is the death which itself dies, because death has no power over the soul of a person. In a way, Donne degrades death and declares happily the importance of death. Now, dear students, there are certain short answer type questions which you have to discuss during the examination. Let me take some examples. Question number 1. Comment on the opening of the sonnet, Death be not proud. Answer would be, in the opening lines of the poem, Donne addresses the death and asks it not to feel proud. Some people have called death powerful and frightening, yet actually it is not so. Now, the poet says people consider death as powerful and frightening, which it is not in actuality. Donne considers death as a poor thing, not a mighty one. He says that people considers death that it is powerful, but death thinks that it kills somebody, but it actually dies itself once a person is no more. Rather, their souls become immortal, which will wake up to live forever once we die. In this way, the soul is more powerful and it conquers death once a person is dead. The people believe that death has so many powerful traits to its existence, and the poet says that death cannot kill even him. What, according to the poet, are the agents of death? Now, the poet says that poison, war, and sickness are the agents of death. Death lives in the bad company of all these elements. Death has to seek their help to kill a person. Death, in fact, is slave to the power of fate, chance, cruel kings, and bad men. Now, opium and other narcotics are as effective as death in inducing us to sleep. Now, the poet says these elements, they give us even more pleasure, like opium and narcotics can give us even more pleasure than the pleasure given to us by death. Now, we can have short rest, then we can do our routine works, but after death we cannot perform all those worldly activities. But the difference is, after death we get total freedom and we become totally independent and rest permanently without any problems. That is why people say that we should not fear death, as soul is immortal and we get permanent rest after that. Now, what does the image of slave suggest? Donne says that death is a captive or slave to the power of fate, chance, kings, and bad men. This slave image of death suggests that death is not powerful. Now, the poet says that death remains as a slave to fate, chance, and kings. What happens when something happens accidentally and people die? Death has to take away their souls. And when kings pronounce some judgment and gives punishment to a person, whether he is innocent or guilty, death has to come to that place to take away the souls. And when some bad men fight, someone from them die and death has to take away their souls. Now similarly, we can say that death is no independent thing. It is under the influence of fate, chance, kings and bad men. It is a kind of thing which people fear, but actually it is not fearful. It only carries out the orders of fate, chance, kings and bad men. Now it has to take the help of poison, war and sickness to show its effect on human beings. Now dear students, another question. Explain the following expression: soul's delivery and death thou shalt die. Answer would be, let us discuss first expression. Soul's delivery means the poet here tells us that death is not a frightening thing or a dreadful thing. After death, our souls become free and immortal. Second expression, death thou shalt die, means he wants to show us that death dies as soon as a person dies on earth or his physical appearance ends on earth as he dies. But once a person dies, his soul becomes free and death has no power remains over the soul. After the death, our bones get rest and our souls become free. The soul wakes up eternally in heaven and becomes immortal. In other words, the soul conquers death. It is the death which has to die itself in the end. The powerful soul is in this way beyond the clutches of the poor death. So the poet pities death and the powerlessness and its weakness is quite exemplified by the poet. Now dear students, there are certain longer type of questions called essay type questions which come in the examination. You have to prepare all these questions with the help of your teachers also if you face any kind of difficulty. What you can do is prepare these questions and send your queries through online mode to your teachers, and you can visit them also if possible in your colleges. Now let us give examples of essay type questions. Question 1. What conclusion do you derive about Donne's religious faith from a reading of Death Be Not Proud? Now let me give you in brief what you have to write in answer. Now Donne is basically a religious priest, as he became priest also while writing poetry. He preached to the world that death is not powerful and it should not feel proud of itself because human beings have their independent existence and they are not under the influence of death because soul is totally free and death cannot kill it in the end. Soul is basically part of some kind of godly influence and we should not fear death in the end. Students, prepare these questions. Now question number 2. Do you agree with Donne that death is nothing but poor death? In answer, we have to write like this. Yes, we definitely agree with Donne that death is nothing but poor death because death has limited power over human beings. It can kill only physical traits or physical appearances of all human beings, but it cannot destroy our souls because death is not independent. Death basically remains under the influence of all those fate, chance, cruel kings and bad men, and it remains in the company of poison because it has to depend on all these elements to take a person's life. Now you have to write answers like this, and I hope that today's lecture of mine has proved useful to you and you have derived some useful things from my today's lecture. And I hope to continue my lectures in future also for the benefit of the students through Director General Higher Education. Let us continue these chain of lectures in future. Thank you so much dear students for listening